Hello and congratulations on getting access to this video course on learning how to speed up your WordPress site. Now, there are a lot of different advantages to speeding up your site in pertaining to user experience and, of course, to getting better rankings with Google and other search engines. So that's what we're going to be covering in this video course. So this is video number 1, which is the introduction and getting started. So first things first, I want to talk about mindsets because I'm a big believer of getting in the right mindset before you get started. So knowing that this is a constant ongoing process is key. You're not going to be able to finish everything all in one day. In fact, speeding up your website, there are so many different variables, different elements. In fact, we're just going to focus on a few, but we're going to focus on the big ones that will help you speed up your whole site, typically about anywhere from 50 to 75%. Now, this is an ongoing process, and I want you to know that. It's like getting a car, a brand new car. You're going to need to constantly maintain it. So just remember that it takes baby steps to complete each and one of these, so don't get overwhelmed. Get a few steps done first, move on, and go from there. So with that said, what I want to do now is give you a quick overview of what's inside this video course. Video number 1 is the introduction, obviously, this video here. Video number 2 is we're going to talk about the advantages of fast site speed. So we talked briefly about the search engine ranking and of course the user experience, but we'll talk more about that in depth. Video number 3, we're going to talk about reasons why your site is slow. So obviously in order to learn how to speed up your site, we need to get you to understand what is slowing your site down. And you might have already seen this, you just didn't know how to speed it up. Or you might have observed this, but you didn't know what was going on. So now you will know. Video number 4, we're going to talk about too much in your site, meaning things in your site, plugins, things that are slowing it down that you could potentially remove. Video number 5, we're going to talk about, is your web host slowing you down? Which definitely a lot of web hosting companies, not the company itself, but the plan that you might be on might be slowing you down. In fact, I've talked to several businesses about this, and many of them did not know that their web hosting plan was actually slowing them down about 50%. In video number 6, we're going to talk about image optimization. So in other words, compressing your images so that they load fast. And video number 7, we're going to talk about Parasite Protection. Yes, indeed, there are parasites out there. In other words, people who are possibly linking to you or even hijacking your site or using your resources. How do you protect against them? Video number 8, we're going to talk about caching. And of course, video number 9, we're going to talk about content delivery networks, which will help people around the globe access your website at a faster rate. And I'll talk more about why not having a content delivery network will actually slow down your user experience. All right, so before we move on to video number 2, let's talk about what you need to have in hand. Obviously, this is made for WordPress sites. You can take this information and the concepts that I'm giving you and apply that to a non-WordPress site, but I'm going to give you specifics in relation to WordPress. And of course, web hosting specifically for WordPress sites, we'll discuss this later, and you'll need to have a cPanel for hotlink protection. Most hosts provide cPanel. If you're not using cPanel, then most likely you do have hotlink protection on it that is typically built in. And of course, you will need to have extra money for possible content delivery networks and image optimization. So let's move on to video number 2. Hello and welcome back. This is video number 2. So let's talk about the advantages of having a website that loads really, really fast. So you already have a glimpse of why site speed is important, but to ensure that we're on the same page, let's discuss why you need to speed up your WordPress site. Now, like I said earlier, there are two major factors at play here. First, we have user experience, and of course, secondly, we have search engine ranking factors. Now, they're both very important, but in reality, you should focus on making sure that the user experience is the best it can be, because if you can think about it, that is who you are trying to impress. That is who you're trying to engage, and ultimately that is who is going to take action, whether that be sign up on your list, buy your product, follow you, become your fan of your brand. So ultimately, like I said, that is who you're trying to impress. Because at the end of the day, even though Google and other search engines change their algorithm, if you look at a long-term view, getting that user the best experience possible will actually impact your search engine ranking. Because at the end of the day, Google and other search engines, their goal is to impress upon the person who is looking for your website. They go to Google, they search, and that is their customer. You are not Google's customer. That is their customer. So that is your customer as well. All right. So it's easy to get in the mindset of, oh, I just want to get rankings, I just want to get traffic. But what then? You get the traffic and then the person who's coming to your site isn't interested and they skip your site and they go to somebody else's. If you impress upon them, you will impress Google. Now, if you think about it for just a second, as information becomes easily accessible within seconds, the human attention span actually gets shorter and shorter. If you think about back in the day, like decades ago, when we didn't have the internet, information was not easily accessible. And because it is now and the demand for data increases and people's patience become shorter, they're able to get information instantly with their smartphones and their tablets and all of that. The patience essentially becomes shorter. So their patience becomes shorter. And as it becomes shorter, so does their patience for your site load speed. So it just makes sense when you look at it that way. The longer your visitors stay, the lower your bounce rate is, which is a technical term for prospects leaving your site. So your goal at the end of the day is to get a lower bounce rate. You don't want a higher bounce rate, you want a lower bounce rate. For example, if somebody goes to Google and they type in a keyword phrase, let's say scuba diving, and they come to your website, they leave, and they go back to Google within seconds. This is what we call bounce rate. If you have a lot of people, let's say out of 100 people, you have 99 people that come to your website and within seconds leave and then go back to Google, Google can detect this and they can see that, okay, for some weird reason, people are going to your site and leaving within seconds. So your site must not be relevant. Your site must not be what they're looking for. And therefore, we're going to rank you lower. All right. So if a large amount of people are doing this, then Google knows that your site is irrelevant. It doesn't have good content, or even if it does, that is what they assume, or the site loads slowly. So if you think about it from that kind of standpoint and you adjust the user experience to be the best it can be, you will actually win the Google search engine game. And that is how you kill two birds with one stone. In other words, win in both areas by really focusing on the user experience first, and then the SEO and all that will come along the way. And even if you're not 100% being optimized to SEO, you will win the game in the long run because people will love your site. So out of 100 people, you may have 50 people who come and go, but you'll have 50 people who stay for anywhere from 15 minutes to 30 minutes to an hour. And that tells Google you will have a 50% bounce rate. So 50% of the people are coming and then going, but 50% of the people are staying and they're liking your content. Now, if you have a lower bounce rate, let's say, for example, 10%, and then the 90 out of 100 people are staying for a long period of time, that tells Google, hey, wait a minute, this site must be extremely relevant. People are obviously staying on the site for a long period of time, and therefore this site must be relevant, this site must be good, and we'll rank it higher. You see what I mean? So now that you have a basic premise of what to look for and what to focus on, let's move on to video number 3 and talk about what slows your site down. Hello and welcome back. This is video number 3, and we're going to talk about reasons why your site is slow. Now, to understand how to speed your site up, you really need to understand first and foremost what is slowing it down. Now, there are hundreds and hundreds of different variables, but our goal here is the 20/80 rule, meaning we're going to find the most common variables, focus on them, that will give you the large amount of impact. So a little bit tweaks here and there, which will give you the biggest impact. And that is our goal here. And instead of trying to teach you hundreds of different variables, which would be time consuming and very overwhelming. So what I advise you to do is implement each one of these one by one. Each one of these can take a good amount of time, some of them less, some of them more, but some of these will make a huge, huge impact on how fast your site loads. And they are, number 1, your WordPress site has just way too many things in it. It's bloated with too much code, with too much plugins, with too much pages, posts, images, everything. It just has way too much in it. If you think about even your computer, if you add too many things onto your PC or your Mac computer as an analogy here, then your computer will become slower and slower and slower, right? So same concept here as well. Your WordPress site just has too many things. Your web hosting is just too slow. That's another big reason we found over the years. We've taken sites from one host and put it on another host, and it was faster. So sometimes the plan that you're under can actually impact how slow and how fast your site loads. Now, bear in mind that the reality is that WordPress sites, in general, after they have become bloated, they use a lot of CPU and server resources. Now, I want to be clear here to say that when you install WordPress by default with nothing on it, it usually runs very, very fast. It's usually because things are added to it like plugins, like images, like other code that tends to slow it down. And another issue is that the majority of websites are hosted on shared hosting. And we'll talk more about that in that particular video, but because it is on shared hosting, you're essentially sharing a server with 100 or more other people, and of course, they will impact your site. So it's not necessarily that you're doing anything wrong. If you have other people on that server that are rocking the boat or doing something, crashing the server, then you're affected as well. And that simply means that your whole website will become slow because with shared hosting, you are sharing the server with hundreds of other people. And either you're sharing a house essentially with hundreds of other people. And we'll discuss this later on. Number 3, your images are way too big. One thing that a lot of us forget about is that different people have different internet speeds. Some are on slower speeds, some are on faster speeds. And just because you have a faster speed doesn't necessarily mean that everybody else has a faster speed. So even if it loads fast with you, it may not run fast with other people. So that's just something to bear in mind. Your images are way too big and they need to be squeezed down. Now, this has always been a problem even decades ago. And according to Google, images often take about 60% of total page weight. In other words, they take up too much room and you need to size them down. And this means that most websites are being slowed down because they have way too many images that are just taking too long to load. So we'll discuss how to optimize all of your images at once or one by one, and how to speed that process up. In fact, I remember back decades ago, when you optimized your images, a lot of times you would have to do it with Photoshop, and you would have to do it one by one, which really can become a pain. But nowadays, there are plugins out there, and there are platforms out there and software applications that will help you essentially speed up and optimize all of your images all at once without ever having to get Photoshop. The next one is hot linking. This means somebody else is linking to your site, your images, your videos, essentially. And what they're doing is they're sending traffic to those images and videos, be getting people that don't even know that it's your images, and they're just stealing your images. And if that's the case, they're essentially using your bandwidth and your server resources. The next thing is caching. Caching is essentially what your internet browser does when you visit sites on a regular basis, and then your browser usually saves tons and tons of images and other files, HTML files and CSS and other files, so that when you go back to that website at a later date, it's already sitting on your computer, and therefore it loads super fast. So you can do the same thing with WordPress, but you need to tell it to do it a certain way. And of course, we'll be discussing this in relation to your WordPress site and all of that. The next thing is content delivery networks. And usually what happens here is when you host a website, let's say, for example, that the web hosting server that you put your website on is in the United States. What that means is that if somebody is on the other side of the world, let's say, for example, the United Kingdom or Australia or Canada or even the Philippines or Russia or anywhere else, and they come to your website, essentially what their computer has to do is it has to travel all the way through the internet, all the way to the USA server just to view your website. So as you can imagine, that will literally slow things down to a halt. So even if it runs super, super fast on your side, they have to go all the way over there or vice versa, and it's really going to slow things down, especially if your customer base is all over the world. If that's the case, this is a definite must, and you'll see why in just a minute. So CDNs are basically web hosting data centers that are positioned all over the world. So all the places that I mentioned just now, let's say, for example, that you're using a CDN, and those servers are placed strategically all over the world, close to those people. So when somebody goes to your website, instead of having to travel all the way back to USA, they essentially are going to go to that location that is nearest to them. So that's what a CDN is all about, and those can be very, very powerful. We'll talk about the different types of CDNs out there as we've tested numerous ones. And with that said, we'll move on to video number 4. Okay, so this is video number 4, and we're going to talk about too much in your site, meaning there's just way too much in your website that it has become literally bloated. So as I stated in the previous video, most WordPress sites take up a lot of resources after the fact that you've started to add a ton of WordPress plugins, images, pages, posts, and other demo content, or the WordPress theme is just bloated with tons of code. So you really want to ask yourself, do I really need this? In fact, a lot of times it's super easy to go through your WordPress site and install a bunch of plugins because it makes your site user experience really amazing. And that's great, but you really need to ask yourself, do I really need this for every single item on your site? If you really haven't thought about this, maybe you need to go back to your WordPress site and go through every single item and ask yourself this. And for the ones that you don't need, delete them, deactivate them. Now, one thing to remember is when you first purchase a WordPress site, it usually comes with a lot of demo content that is built into it to show you what the site could potentially look like. But that said, if you install the demo content and you just tweak it a little bit here and there, and you don't go back and you delete all the demo content, then your site is going to load extremely slow. Now, this often includes unnecessary images, posts, or pages that simply clog up your site. And that's what's happening here. A lot of themes, a lot of times, they'll come with tons and tons of amazing features that look amazing, that are things that potentially could increase your conversions, increase your sales, and all of this greatness. But at the end of the day, here's the thing: the more features and options there are in a theme, the more code there is. The more code that you may never use. The more code there is, the slower the site will run. So plugins are actually a huge variable that will slow down your site, and they'll actually create security backdoors as well. Now, let me clarify. WordPress itself, when you install it by default, that itself is secure. But the plugins that you've installed that are developed by third-party people that are not related to WordPress in any way, those plugins are often programmed, even though they could be programmed to their highest standards, they're not directly from WordPress. All right, so that's something to keep in mind, that there is no real standard. So it's almost like having a computer, whether it's a PC or a Mac, and installing them, the softwares from different third parties other than from Microsoft, right? So you don't know how they programmed it. You don't know if their programming standards are up to par. You don't know any of that. You just know that you installed the software and that's it. And you know that that's something that you really want. Now, it's super easy, if you think about it, to want to start installing tons of different plugins for your WordPress site, because it can make the user experience a lot better. But that's why you really need to ask yourself, do I really need this? So our recommendation to you is to try to stick with the maximum of 10 plugins if at all possible. And if you have to have more plugins, then you really need to think about making sure that your web hosting plan can actually take it. And you've got enough speed, you've got enough resources to be able to handle that. And that's another reason why you need to have a good web hosting plan, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, the number of images is fine, and we'll discuss how to squeeze that down. But when you get to a point where you have hundreds of images or even thousands of images, that can be a problem in itself. Another thing is you want to create posts and pages that you need and remove all the ones that you don't. Now, this will usually speed up your site a little bit, just a tad, but it's just a start. Now, we've seen websites that have had literally hundreds or even thousands of posts, and those sites usually often take a lot more resources to run. So seeing a lot of these sites on shared hosting plans essentially will slow your site down. So go ahead, do a quick clean of your site now, and really think to yourself, do I really need this? Hello and welcome to video number 5, and we're going to talk about your web hosting. And the big question is your web hosting slowing your WordPress site down? Because this is a big variable that a lot of times we just don't even think about. Did you know that most web hosting setups are just not made for WordPress? Especially if you're paying for a shared hosting web hosting plan, which my guess is that the majority of you are using shared hosting. Now, while it may be working now, and if you do have a WordPress site and it is running fast, as you begin to grow, as you begin to build your site out, it will slow things down. So let me explain. And to help you better understand this, I'm going to give you an analogy here. And imagine if you lived in a house, but instead of having 1 or 2 roommates, you now had 100 or 200 roommates. The more roommates you have, the more chaotic it becomes. And if you think about just adding 5 or 10 or 100, it becomes chaotic because now you have other people who may have other different intentions and will affect you in some way. Now, think about it deeper. You barely have any room, obviously. you don't have room in the fridge to store your food. If you have a few roommates that are causing problems, what happens? Well, if you think about it, it often spreads to everybody else, right? If somebody decides, hey, let's go have a party, everybody's going to have a party. Everybody's going to jump in. Now, as silly as this sounds, this is what shared hosting is like. Now, on the flip side, you might have heard of a dedicated server. A dedicated server, they tend to cost a lot more money, about $150 to $200 per month, but it's kind of like owning your house. And instead of having 100 roommates or even 2, you own that house, it's on your own rules, and whatever happens in that house happens in that house. But it's usually well worth it, that amount of money, because you don't have to worry about others trying to mess up your life. Now, most of you will not be able to afford $150 to $200 a month, especially if you're starting out as a small business. So the next best thing is what we call a VPS, or virtual private server in short. Now, let me give you an analogy. This is like living in an apartment, right? With your own room. So you got a big apartment or a big server, and the apartment is split up into individual rooms. So you have your own room within the whole apartment housing. That's what a VPS, or virtual private server, is. Now, whatever happens in your own room affects your room. If you drop a plate, if you drop some milk, if something bad happens in your room, you get a flood, then it floods. Now, you might be thinking, well, if I flood, won't it affect the other rooms? Yeah, it might be, but in a real virtual private server, it's basically like having a house where whatever somebody affects you in the other apartment, like maybe below you or above you, they're not going to affect you, right? So if they crash their server, they crash their website, that will not affect you. And that's the beauty of a VPS, or a virtual private server. So in other words, what others do in that room doesn't affect you. Now, that said, not all VPSs are created equal either. In fact, there are a lot of web hosting companies out there that fully understand and specialize in WordPress. So the way they set it up, the way they set up the memory, the hard drives, the way they set up the software, it's optimized for WordPress. It's kind of like going to a cardiologist for your heart problems versus a general practitioner. So the general practitioner, they may understand a little bit about your heart and how to help you, but the cardiologist is really going to know how to help you. So you're going to a specialized web host, essentially, to get hosted, because they understand your needs specifically. They understand WordPress and how it operates. So that's why I say a lot of VPSs out there are not made for WordPress. And therefore, even if you get a VPS in general, you might find that your site does not run fast. But if you find a WordPress specialized web hosting company, you'll find that your WordPress site will actually run fast, because they understand what affects what. They've actually essentially taken all these variables and made it easier for you to make sure that your site is running fast. So let's discuss a few places that would be great for running your WordPress site. So what you're looking for is managed WordPress hosting. The first one that we recommend is called WPEngine.com, and they specialize in WordPress. Now, one thing I will say is whenever you look at the pricing will cost a little bit more than a usual web host sometimes, but that's because they specialize inside WordPress. So when you get an account with them, they will set it up so that it is WordPress friendly. And like I said, most virtual private servers or dedicated servers are not really made for WordPress. So WPEngine.com is a good one. The next one is called WPXHosting.com. And one thing to note is I would definitely not recommend places like HostGator.com. There are other places out there that say they're WordPress hosting, but these two definitely we've heard really, really good things about from numerous people. And we've actually taken a lot of sites off of HostGator for our clients and moved it elsewhere. Even though a lot of these web hosting companies will say that they are WordPress friendly, a lot of times that's kind of like a general practitioner and you're having a heart problem and you're just going to them. And they're saying, well, we could offer you some advice for your heart. But in reality, like I said, you want to go to a specialist. And these web hosting companies specialize in WordPress. So definitely can recommend these two for your WordPress site. Okay, so welcome to video number 6, and we're going to talk about image optimization. So we touched base briefly on this earlier in the previous videos, but like I said, most WordPress sites have slow loading images. Not just WordPress sites, but websites in general. Especially depending on where your visitor is located and of course how fast their internet connection is. Now, you have to assume that your visitors don't have a fast internet speed because you want it to be as fast as possible. So in this day and age, if you really think about it, you need to have images on your site because it creates more human engagement. So you can't say, I'm not going to have any images either and just go with text because otherwise that would just be boring, right? So one thing to keep in mind is firstly, you want to make sure that you have the right file format. So for example, JPEGs and PNG files are what you want to use when it comes to putting them on your blogs, on your WordPress site, and all that. JPEGs and PNGs are file formats or images, essentially, that are squeezed down and they are compressed, but they are for web use. Now, GIFs, on the other hand, are basically animated images, but they are also compressed as well. And like I said, these files are very, very web friendly. Now, back in the day, you would have to manually compress your images. So say, for example, like I said, you had 100 or 200 images. What you would have to do is you would manually go into Photoshop, you would open the image, you would save it from, let's say it would be normally 5 megabytes, for example, and you would save it as a JPEG or a PNG, and it would decrease it down to a file size of about 100 to 200 kilobytes. So we have about 1,000 kilobytes within 1 megabyte. So you would be able to compress it a good amount, but yet if you add it up, and let's say you have 100 kilobytes per image, and then you have 10 images, that's already 1 megabyte. So that's the problem that you would face, is that the more images you have, it just adds up. So that was back in the day. Now you can, and the good news is that there are a number of tools and WordPress plugins that will actually help you achieve this without you having to buy Photoshop and how to learn it and all of that. So let's go ahead and discuss them right now, and I'm going to show it to you so that you're aware of what's out there. So what you're looking for is a WordPress plugin that you can simply install into your WordPress site that will automate the process of optimizing and compressing your images. At the end of the day, you're going to be busy, so you're not going to have time to sit there and optimize. You need something that will kind of do it automatically every time you upload an image. So we've tested several of them, and out of the ones that we've tested, we've come down to 2. The one that we really like is called Smush Image Compression and Optimization. So if you go to wordpress.org/plugins/wp-smushit, so that's SMUSHIT, so smush it. So when you go here, there are some free levels. There are some obviously paid levels as well. But this is the one that we tested that out and it actually worked. We have tested other ones out and they've actually messed up our site. But this one definitely we can definitely recommend. So come here. You can also go into your WordPress dashboard and do a search for WP Smush It or just Smush Image. And of course, look for the author. The author is going to be WPMU space dev. So this one's good. Another one is called EW Image Optimizer. It's EWWW Image Optimizer. And that's another good one as well. This is video number 7, and we're going to talk about Parasite Protection. Parasites in the insect world include ticks and leeches. They find a host to suck their blood to survive. So essentially, you are the host, and somebody out there is the parasite. So same in the digital world. You have other people who are linking to your images, to your videos, and other big files. Now, this is not to be confused by backlinks. These are not people who are linking to your site because your site is of a good resource. These are people who are linking to you because they're either claiming your images as theirs, your videos as theirs, and your big files as theirs. So you might be thinking, why would somebody do that? Well, that's very common if you think about it. If you've got images on your website, most likely Google has indexed your images into their Google image search engine. And somebody else has come along the image search engine and look for an image, and they might think, oh, I like that image. I'm going to use that on my website. And either they might give you credit, which is great, but that's far and few. And then most likely they might think, well, I like this image. I'm going to link to it, and I'm going to put it on my web host. Now, if you get too many of those, eventually what happens is they begin to use your server resources that you pay for. They're not paying for it, you're paying for it. And then they use your videos and they're going to use your bandwidth that you pay for. So keeping that in mind, you're going to need to protect yourself, right? So, like I said, what ends up happening is that you are spending money on more web hosting resources. Now, the way that you can protect yourself with this is by using what we call cPanel, which is a web hosting panel, a very popular one that most web hosting companies use. Now, if you don't have cPanel and you're one of those far and few between, in those cases, sometimes your web hosting company will have rebranded the cPanel to look like their own brand, but usually you can find the hot linking feature that I'm going to talk about in just a minute right there. If not, sometimes they will have their own hot linking feature, but essentially what it does is it disables people from essentially becoming a parasite of your website and using your server resources. So if your web hosting company doesn't use cPanel, like I said, they may have that option. And if they don't, you can always message them and say, hey, do you have hot link protection? Now, to better understand how to implement this, let me show you step by step how to do that. So what you want to do is go ahead and log into your cPanel. If you need to do that, go ahead and pause the video and do that now. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that you are in your cPanel. So to get to hotlink protection, all you need to do is simply scroll down and go to the security section here, and we see hotlink protection. So go ahead and click on that. And if you look at it, it says hot link protection prevents other websites from directly linking to you. So what we need to do is, we don't need to enable it yet, but what we need to do is enter the URLs to allow access. So what this means is that, let's say, for example, let's just hypothetically use yourdomain.com. What you want to do is enter yourdomain.com, and what that means is that anytime yourdomain.com accesses the image, it's okay. But anytime somebody else that is not yourdomain.com accesses your site, then they will be denied, essentially. So what you want to do is do http:// and then yourdomain.com. And that should be it. But if you use www, or you have, let's say, HTTPS, you could add that as well. Now, hypothetically, that shouldn't really matter, but for the sake of, just to make sure, we'll just do that. So these are just variations of yourdomain.com. So we can enter that here, and let's say, for example, that you want a other site. Let's say you have a yourseconddomain.com. If you put http://yourseconddomain.com. So let's say, for example, that you have a sister site, and that sister site, it'll be okay if they access your images. So you want to enter that here. So basically what you're telling the system is these domains are okay with accessing these images or whatever file that is. So if you want to add, like, let's say, MP4 files. So if you have videos on your site and you only want these sites to access them, you want to make sure that you have the file formats inside here. So another thing, if there are zip files, downloadable .zip files, you want to put zip. So that means anytime somebody accesses any type of these file formats from these sites, it's okay. If they access it elsewhere from somebody else, it's going to block them. It's going to prevent them. Now, you have different choices. You can enter a redirect URL. So if somebody tried to access that image and they're doing so from a different site, then you can redirect them to another page. So whatever page that you want. And this can be good depending on what kind of business you're in. So for example, if you are a photographer and you don't mind people licensing your images, then you could redirect them to maybe your page where you're trying to sell licensing to images. Now, obviously, if you're not in that case, then you wouldn't really need that. But that's just there if you want to redirect people to a certain page. So once you're done, you just simply click submit and then you click enable and you're good to go. This is video number 8, and we're going to talk about WordPress caching. So as discussed earlier, the way caching works is your internet browser makes a copy of the items on the page, such as images, text, and other media elements. So as you can imagine, the purpose of this is that the next time you visit a website, your browser will load the site at a much faster rate. Now, you can do the same thing with your WordPress site so that your returning visitors can experience the same thing. So that way they visit it once and it might load somewhat slow, but the next time they visit it, it'll load really, really fast. So let's discuss some of the most popular caching plugins right now. So when it comes to WordPress caching plugins, a lot of times you'll see that a lot of people will say that the W3 Total Cache is the biggest, baddest, best plugin out there. Now, we've had the chance to test this out, and yes, it does have good results, but at the same time, it's very complex and there's a lot of different settings within it. So there's somewhat of a learning curve in order to use this. Now, the next one that is on the recommended list is the WP Super Cache, and that is by Automatic. And if you're not familiar with Automatic, as you can see here, that's Automatic. This is the same company that has developed WordPress. So they are literally the biggest WordPress company because they invented WordPress. If you look through here, you'll see that a lot of people have installed it. A lot of the reviews are really good. They say lightning's fast speed, works really well. And that's the thing I like about Automatic is that whenever you get plugins from them, you're pretty much guaranteed that the plugin will run. And it will run effectively because they'll come out with tons and tons of updates simply because they invented WordPress. So they have the best of the best knowledge as far as that goes. Now, these are caching plugins that focus on one area. Another plugin that we have actually tested and had really good results is vipercache.com. That's vipercache.com. All right, that's it. This is video number 9, and we're going to talk about content delivery networks. So we briefly talked about this earlier, but in most cases, when you run a website, you want to have a CDN or a content delivery network, especially if you're trying to reach the world. Now, as we mentioned earlier, if your web hosting server, let's say, for example, is in the United States of America, and your prospect is, let's say, in the United Kingdom or Canada or wherever, some way far away, then what happens here is that they have to connect all the way from their computer in the UK all the way to the server in the USA. So if you are in the US of A, or you're in wherever you are, and the server happens to be next to you, then it's going to load super, super fast, right? But just because it loads fast for you, if you're in the United States, does not mean that it's going to load super fast for everybody else. So it's kind of like saying, okay, I'm going to go to the store and it's only going to take me 5 minutes. But then you have a friend that is an hour away and it's going to take them literally an hour away, not speaking of traffic and other possible roadblocks that he's going to face. So that's why you need a content delivery network. And in this case, in that example, let's say, for example, it takes you 5 minutes to get to the store. And that store says, you know what, we're going to replicate ourselves and we're going to put a store near your friend so that instead of going 1 hour away, he goes about 5 minutes away. So that's the way a content delivery network works. They are so massive of a data center that they have many different servers placed all over the world, oftentimes in each city, in each country, in each state, literally so that anybody around the world can access your site at a much faster rate. So oftentimes what we see is the content delivery network will make a big, big difference. So if you change your web hosting to a specialized WordPress hosting and you add a content delivery network and you do the elements that we talked about to make sure that your site is not too big, those things, those few things there can actually speed up your whole site. So like I said, how CDNs work is they deliver the content, in this case, to that person, to the closest server to them. So as we mentioned in this example, if you're using a CDN, it's going to show your website to that person, to the closest server. So it really makes life a lot better for your visitors, no matter where they are. So now there are many other benefits to using a CDN besides just being close. In addition to that is security. And you can actually block out high-risk areas and high-risk IP addresses as well. Because the CDN is so big and massive, a lot of times it'll share data, and if it finds that there's a hacker hacking another site, they'll share that data and make sure that they block that person when they try to access your site. So there are a lot of other amazing benefits to having a CDN. Now, there are several CDNs that you can use. You, of course, only need to have one. So let's discuss that right now. So there are two main content delivery networks that we highly, highly recommend. There are many other ones, but you really have to think about it. You want to make sure that the company that you go with is big enough so that you have so many different servers around the world that you can use. So these two are actually very user-friendly, and that is why we are actually recommending them. Cloudflare.com, that's cloudflare.com. This one we've used before, and in order to really make use of it, they have a free version, but in order to get the advantages and the benefits, you really have to use the $20 per month upgrade. And this is on a per domain basis. Now, at the end of the day, and that might seem a lot to many of you, but really, it'll save you a lot of bandwidth. In fact, it'll protect you. It'll give you security that you need. Plus, on top of that, if you have a global wide network, you're trying to reach as many people around the world as much as possible, it really is going to help you in the long run. The only case that you would never really need to have a CDN is if you're only a local business and you're simply trying to cater to people within a very small segment of a city and they're all next to the server. So that's the only time that you would not really use a CDN. Cloudflare we've used and it's worked very, very well. And we highly recommend that. You don't really need the business version or the enterprise unless you're getting a ton of traffic. But obviously you can start with free and just see how that goes. And then as time goes, upgrade to pro if you can. So if you're just starting out, obviously go with the free. And if you already have a couple hundred to a couple thousand visitors per month, definitely go with the pro version as much as possible. So the next thing we have is MaxCDN, that is maxcdn.com. And as you can see, the pricing is actually a little bit cheaper than Cloudflare. Now, MaxCDN is really good as well. And it's really hard to say whether MaxCDN is better than Cloudflare or Cloudflare is better than MaxCDN. Because at the end of the day, it really depends on really your preference. So you could start with MaxCDN because it's only $9 a month and they offer a good amount of benefits as well. Now you'll see that they limit you up to 1 terabyte. So what that means is really unless you're using 1 terabyte, which is 1000 gigabytes worth of bandwidth, you don't really need to move up. So that's the nice thing about MaxCDN is their pricing definitely wins a little bit better than Cloudflare. But as far as setup goes for both of these are actually very easy to set up. They've made it very, very user-friendly, and that's one of the main reasons why we recommend them on top of their huge network and being able to reach as many visitors as you can.